This brings me to today's agenda, and normally at an event like this is when I would turn things over to the panelists. But before I do that, because this is a panel on alternative academic careers, I wanted to share a little bit about my own story, since some of you may or may not know, but all of the assistant directors at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching have PhDs in a wide variety of disciplines. So I wanted to share a little bit about my path into my career. I had never actually heard of the field of educational development before I began my graduate studies at the University of Michigan. So for those of you who might be new to the term, educational development basically seeks to enhance teaching and learning on campuses through individual work with faculty and GSIs, as well as institutional programs with departments or units on campus. We had an earlier similar session, and there was a faculty developer from EMU at that panel who said she saw her role as drawing the potential out of people. So I thought that was a much more concise and broad way of thinking about it, so I thought I would share that. But I encountered educational developers through the workshops and consultations that CRLT does on this campus to support graduate students as teachers when I was a new GSI. So I was a GSI, and later in my department became a graduate student mentor. I'm sure in some of your departments you have those types of positions. And I discovered at that point that CRLT offered support for people who are interested in mentoring other instructors. And through those trainings, I learned that CRLT basically had a mentor program, a campus-wide mentor program called the Graduate Teaching Consultant Program. I see one of our graduate teaching consultants here today, but basically people like George, who's in the back here, work with other graduate students on campus on their teaching by visiting their classes or consulting with them about their teaching. So I engaged in that group and found that it was really fun to talk with people about their teaching and empower them to improve in their teaching and improve student learning in their classrooms. And I remember one evening telling my spouse that I couldn't believe CRLT was paying me to do this because it was so fun. And he said, you know, maybe you should consider that as a career option, because I've never heard you say that about your dissertation research. So that actually was a pivotal moment for me. And so I pursued several concrete strategies to pursue that as a possible career path. So I cultivated relationships with mentors at CRLT, and I visited other teaching centers in Michigan, and I also attended the National Professional Conference for Educational Developers. So all of those things were really useful and enlightening, and I guess I just wanted to emphasize the strategy that I found most useful in pursuing an educational development career was the first one I mentioned, which was identifying mentors outside of my department who were in the career field that I was potentially interested in. I invited someone who I saw as a mentor, the woman who coordinated the program, the GTC program at the time, to coffee, and basically just asked her about her career path and asked her to tell me what she thought the benefits and drawbacks were of her career compared to a traditional faculty career. And I also visited Michigan State's Teaching Center, and I had a similar sit-down interview just to hear the perspective of the director and provost at Michigan State. So I asked both of them what their experiences were like and what experiences I should try to gain as a graduate student if I were interested in making myself qualified for that career path. And then I set about pursuing those things while I was still doing my disciplinary research and teaching. So I just wanted to share that a little bit, just to point out that at a lot of events on campus, there's lots of people in alternative academic career roles like myself, and I'm now going to turn things over to our official panelists to have them share their stories similarly. And I just wanted to say that if anyone does, I'll be facilitating Q&A after folks share their stories. And if anyone does have specific questions to educational development, I'm happy to answer those at that time. So I'm now going to turn things over to our panelists, and we'll start with Dr. Milkova.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here because when I was finishing my dissertation 5 years ago, I knew that there were two distinct paths available to me. And so my PhD is in art history, so I knew I could either go into teaching or pursue a curatorial career. But there was very little crossover between those two different paths. And I wasn't sure which one I wanted to pick and how I could really capitalize on my experience in both fields. So I ended up finding my dream job using both of those expertises that I had gained in graduate school. So let me just backtrack a little bit and say that I am currently the curator of academic programs at the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College and Conservatory. The Allen Museum is primarily a teaching institution with an excellent encyclopedic collection, which means that we have art that represents many cultures, time periods, and geographic regions. In fact, the Allen Museum at Oberlin is considered one of the 3 academic divisions of Oberlin College, the other 2 being the College of Arts and Sciences and the Conservatory of Music. As I said earlier, I'm an art historian by training. My PhD is in modern and contemporary art from the University of Pennsylvania. I also hold a BA degree in Old World Archaeology from Brown University. I completed my postdoctoral training at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and came to Oberlin with a background in teaching and curatorial work. And my job at the Allen really draws significantly on both of these experiences every single day. So my position there is essentially an administrative position I've headed for the last 3.5 years. My role as curator of academic programs is to facilitate the use of the collection as a teaching tool and the galleries as a learning site. I serve as the liaison between the museum and the faculty, and mostly faculty from non-art disciplines, helping them identify and develop meaningful ways of integrating art into their teaching, ways that meet their course goals and learning objectives, as well as offer an active and diverse learning experience. In essence, the Office of Academic Programs maximizes the museum's capacity to engage deeply and effectively with the curriculum through a number of programs. And those programs include teaching exhibitions, individual museum class visits, museum-based courses, student assistantships, faculty workshops, and curriculum development grants, again for faculty. And just to give you an example of the scope of this academic outreach that I'm responsible for, I want to tell you that each semester we welcome about 200 individual class visits from courses. We work with 20 to 25 different departments across the College of Arts and Sciences and Conservatory of Music, for example, biology, English, history, environmental studies, neuroscience, computer science, music theory, and really the list is very long. And just this past semester, in fact, we welcomed 220 class visits from 69 different courses across the curriculum taught by 56 professors in 21 departments. So because of this, the scope of our outreach, we're also actively thinking about the pedagogic value of teaching with original works of art. And I really mean with, rather than strictly about art or art history. We often collaborate with Oberlin Center for Teaching Innovation and Excellence to offer faculty professional workshops and training sessions so we can equip professors, non-art professors, to teach on their own, to give them the tools to approach art as a learning material, to really make the object speak. So in essence, I plan, research, coordinate, and then teach or co-teach with faculty class visits to the museum, and each class visit really is conceived of as a mini exhibition around a selection, very carefully selected works of art, usually 10 to 15 objects that have been selected based on a particular idea or a larger theme, and also that focus on a particular question. In other words, just as an exhibition has a message or a thesis, really, the same way every class visit that we develop at Oberlin has its own mini thesis, its own purpose, to help students understand the material better, to illustrate concepts that they're grappling with, or really to provide a broader cultural context for what they're learning. In addition, I manage the print study room at the museum, which is a lab-like space where students can encounter works of art in a more private, intimate environment and gain hands-on experience. I also organize various training sessions and workshops for new and returning faculty, for faculty who teach first-year seminars. I also supervise and train both current undergraduates and recent graduates. I have a full-time assistant who's an Oberlin grad, a recent Oberlin grad, and we also have 2 part-time student assistants who help us research, but also they actually handle the works of art. They help us bring objects from storage every day. Finally, I continue to attend professional conferences. I try to publish in my field of art historical expertise, but also in the field of pedagogy. So I try to stay up to date with what's going on in my scholarly field, but also in my day job as well. So Laura asked me to also tell you a little bit about how I ended up in this career. So I have to admit that I have a fairly standard traditional training in art history. I had 3 years of coursework covering the entire history of art, as well as my area of modern and contemporary art. In graduate school, I had the opportunity to serve as a teaching assistant, also teach my own classes, as well as curate 5 different exhibitions. All of those exhibitions were at galleries or museums within college or university campuses. So even though I didn't know it back then, I was already gaining some experience dealing with objects in multidisciplinary settings. I was also lucky to have 2 curatorial fellowships, one at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia and the other one at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and that really was part of my graduate school funding. And those gave me the opportunity to work with objects, gave me a very hands-on experience, really taught me how to communicate through objects, and this was essential in landing the job at Oberlin. So all of this experience, coupled with the interdisciplinary focus of my dissertation, and just as an aside, I'll tell you that I wrote a dissertation on Soviet underground art and its socio-political context. So because of this interdisciplinary focus and my hands-on training working with objects and my teaching experience, I think I had the perfect package to get the job and also be successful at it. And finally, I'm going to talk briefly about the different skills that I find most useful in my job. Clearly, the knowledge and understanding of art historical material is essential, but not only knowing about styles and movements and artists, but really being up to date with the scholarly literature is important. My teaching experience comes in very handy as well. I often work with students who have no art history background whatsoever, so it's really important to be able to communicate to them in an accessible way, clearly, in a clear and accessible way. My research skills also come in handy, project management skills. If you think of your dissertation as one huge project that you've managed over the years successfully, then all of this counts because we're constantly planning for the future exhibitions, collaborations with departments, symposium, and so on and so forth. And finally, the ability to work with faculty and colleagues. I'm constantly meeting, talking, brainstorming with professors who don't know anything about art history, and on my end, I don't know anything about their fields, biology or environmental studies or neuroscience. And so it's really important to be able to meet in the middle somewhere, to really reach a point where you can meet the other halfway. And I find this moment of negotiating their expertise and my expertise in order to select the objects that would work best for their purposes. So it's not about the art historical significance and value of the collection, but it's about how it can teach us about the world. So I think this is in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer any and all of your questions later.
Yeah, thanks, Liliana. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Tyson now.
Hi, I'm Henry Tyson. So if I let out a big yawn at any point on the panel, it's not from boredom of anything. I came back from seeing Book of Mormon last night with 80 honor students, and so I got home about 1 o'clock, which is the middle of the night for me. It was still an early evening for them. They were looking forward to going home and discussing, but I'm suffering today. So I really do have, I I tell people all the time, and I kind of believe it, that I have one of the best jobs at the university, working in the honors program. So the story I'll tell has a happy ending. But it took a lot of twists and turns to get there. My story is the opposite of Laura's. I did not really do any additional professional development or training. And I followed my very esoteric tenure track dreams in classical studies and philosophy. I won't say to the bitter end. I ended up here, and I love it here. But I followed him a long way. You know, I fell in love with philosophy, and then I won't give all the twists and turns of how I got into classical philosophy. But I fell in love with that, and that was what I wanted to study, and that's what I spent all of my time in graduate school doing: reading texts, learning ancient languages. Involving myself in reading groups. We had a pedagogical training seminar that we went through, and I had always thought that I wanted to go into this profession in order to teach. But I really pursued the content of my disciplinary interests all the way up until I got here. So the quick version of the story is that I'm half of a dual academic career partnership. I finished my PhD at Emory. My first faculty position was at William and Mary. I actually was offered that position on the night that we were headed out to dinner to celebrate my wife's graduation. She'd already accepted a residency at University of Missouri. So we were then 17 hours apart, you know, newly married. I think we'd been married a year. And after a year of that, we decided that we didn't want to do that anymore. And so I did what all of my friends in the field thought was just insane, and gave up that position and went back to a PhD program in classical languages and literature at University of Missouri, and stayed there for the duration of Melissa's residency. Her residency had a PhD option. She decided that she wanted to take a clinical professorship route rather than a research route, and so she left that program with a master's and accepted a position here. And I followed her here originally on a 2-year research fellowship that we negotiated with philosophy and classics, which was ideal for me. I mean, my dream job, to have Angel Hall, the two ends of the hall. I honestly walked down Angel Hall when I got here, and you know, I used this person's article in my dissertation, this person's book. Not a good negotiating strategy. I admitted that I would have taken the job for free. And immediately after I got here, as you do with the 2-year fellowship, I started putting out applications. Jobs for Philosophers comes out in early October, and so I had barely unpacked in my office, and I'm applying again, and got a tenure track offer at a school that I really would have wanted to be at. Turned that down, thinking, you know, if I've been successful here, there'll be another one. And another one never came. So this is why I told you there's a happy ending to this story. Because I had a whole series of near misses, you know, heartbreaking, coming in second. We had a disconnect. Melissa will always want to be at a large research institution, a medical research institution. My ideal would be a small liberal arts college like Oberlin. And so it was a negotiation back and forth. We managed to extend my fellowship, and I was willing to start exploring what I might do here. And so I started actually with CRLT. I thought of teaching as my main transferable skill set. And so CRLT was a natural place to start exploring that. I applied for a position at CRLT and didn't get it. I had a really good conversation with Matt in which he said, why do you want this position? You know, everything you've been doing, all of your sort of impressive activities and goals are with undergraduates. Aren't you going to miss that student contact working, you know, in faculty development? And that was a really great moment for me. And in each of these, you know, sort of painful applications and rejections that I had, you know, I learned a new piece. So then I applied for an instruction position with Sweetland. And by the time we got through the end of that interview, there was a mutual agreement that I loved teaching philosophy and classics and teaching writing there as a tool for doing that, but I didn't really want to teach writing as such in that. So then I applied for a position in the honors program, didn't get that. I'm starting to feel extremely discouraged at this point. My fellowship is coming to an end. And Donna Wessel-Walker, the associate director, said, if you really want to do this kind of stuff, you ought to go talk to Tim Dodd, who's the director of the Noonan Advising Center. And so I went to talk to Tim about what a career in advising would be like, and found out that, at least at Michigan, it was a much different position than I had imagined. We have a wonderful model here of hiring people largely from the academic stream, thinking if you hire very good intellectuals from academic positions, you can train them to do the advising part. And so it's a wonderful center that has all sorts of really interesting people from interdisciplinary backgrounds and really substantive opportunities for substantive conversations with students. So I applied for a position in the Noonan Center. I didn't get it. I was not quite ready yet. I still thought of myself as faculty. And what I realized in retrospect in all of these applications and these interviews, I had the idea that I was deigning to take an administrative job, right? That I still thought of myself as seeking that faculty tenure track position, was willing to deign to take these things. And Tim said, you're just not ready yet, and it took a little time. I learned a really great thing from somebody in the dual career office too when I was applying for that, since you wanted some specific things. I had always, in my faculty searches, you list all of your accomplishments. You list your publications, your presentations, your awards, your fellowships, and so as I was doing this for these administrative positions, what Melissa Dorfman, who works in the dual career office for medicine engineering, she said, what's the rhetorical point here, that they should give you this job because you deserve it somehow? And it was revealing to me that was my unspoken attitude in a lot of these things. She said, what you should do is analyze the job description and say, what are the skills and character traits that somebody really needs in order to flourish in that position? And then how can you tell them that you've got those things? What stories can you tell? And that was a great moment for me. It's the core of my advising philosophy that I use with students all the time. What I discovered was that I actually did have all sorts of skill sets, and they were largely around personal interaction with students. And so when I got the position in the Noonan Advising Center, I'm having conversations all day with students about their interests, about their skill sets, about their aspirations. And that's really where my core abilities and sort of native talents. And then a bunch of things from my past started to make sense. I used to frustrate my colleagues because I would do things like take on Europe students. I would hold, I would do readings with students and with graduate students that were sort of outside, and they kept saying, you don't have time to be doing any of this stuff. You need to be publishing. You need to be publishing. And looking back, I see that it was all of those skills and interests that were trying to come out in those activities. And once I reconciled myself with the fact that I actually do have a lot of other things to offer, I really started to flourish in my position. And frankly, my subjective well-being has gone up a lot more than it was when I had a research fellowship that was the envy of a lot of my academic colleagues. So that's come to fruition in the honors program, because now I'm not only working with University of Michigan. I will throw this, this sounds elitist, and again, my academic friends were aghast when I took an advising position, and it took me a little while to realize sort of what advising often is at other institutions where they might be. And so I will say that advising at University of Michigan, and I don't think we're unique in this, but I would sort of, if you're looking at going in an advising direction, have some conversations with people here, and then have some conversations at target schools where you might be going to find out what advising is like there. But here, University of Michigan students are fantastic, the honors students are fantastic, and then what I specifically do now is work with our scholarship students for competitive national scholarships. So Rhodes and Marshall are the the most well-known of these, but we just had mock interviews for our Truman scholars today, all three of our nominees for the Truman Scholarship, which is a scholarship for students who want to go into public service careers. They all got finalist interviews. I've been working with students on the new Wallenberg Fellowship for graduating seniors. We're just starting to recruit for Rhodes and Marshall for next year. So I get to talk with these just truly extraordinary students and work with them on their personal statements. All of those writing skills that I had, I'm now using in personal statements. Even one of my undergraduate majors was in comparative literature, and I even find that a lot of my techniques in literary analysis I can use when we're sort of talking about how the different themes of an application package, a personal statement, a project proposal, can all come together. And so I get a chance to use all of these core skills. I'm also in a wonderful position to be able to still talk to students about, so I was almost late coming here because I was talking to a pre-med student who's a philosophy major. And so I have a lot of opportunities for those really wonderful things. I still do some publishing, and that it's kind of trickling out as my pipeline has not been renewed on the supply end. That started to sort of trickle out, and I'm facing the question of whether I want to keep on doing that. But I think I'll leave any more of that for the Q&A, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Henry. What a diverse panel we have today. So my story is a little bit different, which I think is a good thing to have for a panel. I actually was an honors program dropout as an undergraduate at University of Michigan. So I actually did 3 degrees here. I've been here for quite a while. And my path was unexpected. So the title, I saw the signs coming upstairs today, pursuing. I was like, I don't think I've actually actively pursued, but I can do the best that I can to try and articulate the experiences that led to skills that led to where I am now, and also instances of making your own luck. I think it all begins when I was a child and my mother made me take piano lessons. I didn't enjoy it at the time. I really resisted. But, I tell my mother that, because I played piano for so many years, and I did come to love it. And actually in our art museum is a piano that I played on when I was a child that was donated, and I love to go see it. That when I actually worked as a transcriber as a graduate student. And as a transcriber, you get into research teams. You end up sitting at the table with some really wonderful researchers, as so many are at University of Michigan. And you get at a different level. One of the things that's really beautiful about U of M is the vast amount of resources. It's really remarkable. Also, it's a very non-hierarchical environment. So one thing that means is that it's decentralized, and sometimes things are not so organized. The other thing is that even as an undergraduate student, I might be sitting at a table with a lab, and I would be asked for my opinion, just as were the doctoral students, just as were the other faculty members on the team. And that wasn't unusual to me. That was just the norm. I didn't ever think of that as unusual because this is the only environment I've been in. With that, I had no plans for graduate school. I really wanted to continue my career bussing tables at Zingerman's and possibly working my way up to barista to work the espresso machine. That was a really big deal. I probably wouldn't have made it to the espresso machine. But, I worked in bakeries. I was, baking cookies at night. I was always working part-time jobs throughout undergraduate and throughout graduate school. My mentor, who I started working for as a junior, as a part-time research assistant, I was a terrible student. I will just be frank about this. If I did not like a class, I just stopped going. Or I would just go to the office hours to talk to the GSI or professor, because what's the point of sitting with other students in class if they don't know what they're talking about? It's more fun to just talk to the GSI. I really did not care about my grades. And I think which probably is not such a great thing, and so I don't advocate that to my students, but I think what it allowed me to do was just to really kind of enjoy life and enjoy interactions with people. So I see a lot of my experiences as having been built up through relationships. I really enjoyed research. I loved data entry, which is so tedious, but I just loved it. So I would go in and do extra hours in the evening. And I think my advisor didn't realize it was because I had all that time because I wasn't studying in my other classes. But he said, wow, what a great data entry person. So he just kept asking me back semester after semester, and I used up my experiential credits. And so he said, just keep coming back, we'll pay you hourly. And then when it came time for me to graduate, he asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to go to India, to Dharamsala, to work with Tibetan refugees and meet the Beastie Boys. And to his credit, I think I'm really here because so many people have, talked to me not as this is what you should do, but really spoke to me as a student and said, okay, that's what you want to do. We'll try and help you get there. And so he told me about a fellowship. He said, hey, I heard about this fellowship where you could get money and you could actually travel to India. And so he didn't know much about it. So I went to the Center for South Asian Studies. I said, I heard about this fund. And they said, oh, it's only for graduate students. So I said, okay, give me an application. So I applied to the graduate program so that I could apply to the fellowship so that I could go to India and work. And I did write about the Beastie Boys in my personal statement. It's a little embarrassing now, but I found it a couple of years ago when I found my old zip drive. And, I was just very fortunate. But I think probably because of the research background I had and experience that I was seen as a viable candidate despite my abysmal grades. When I finished the master's program, I ended up not meeting the Beastie Boys, but that's okay. I ended up becoming really interested in female infanticide issues in Asia, so more about sex-selective abortions was more my area in India, South Korea, China. I had a very interdisciplinary experience. I just loved it, and again, for me, that was the norm. I didn't see it as interdisciplinary. I just saw it as that's the way you do things. I thought I wanted to go into public health. I went to visit the Master's in Public Health program at Harvard. The doctoral students didn't let me sit at the table with them, even though we hadn't started school yet. I found it a little snooty. All the students from California were saying, it's too cold here and we can get in-state tuition at Berkeley. We're not coming. And I didn't like it, one, because I realized that's when I learned that public health master's was a professional school. I was used to an academic environment, and it's very different. The love, the engagement, the intellectual thought, the lack of fear in really exploring ideas for the sake of exploring ideas. And all of the graduating students I spoke to at Harvard who had spent $100,000 for a 2-year program were going home to live with their parents because they hadn't found jobs yet. So I was like, red light, red flag. No. So I came back, and I had been admitted to the Psychology Women's Studies Joint Doctoral Program here, which I applied to at my advisor's suggestion. I ended up staying. And actually, the current position I have as director of the Global Scholars Program, I was hired on before I finished school. So I was ABD, all but dissertation. Really, the dissertation was kind of an afterthought almost, because I remember rushing, like right before my dissertation, I did a trip to Korea to negotiate with the dean at Seoul National University to start a new class, and then rushed back here to do edits on my dissertation. I defended, and then had a marketing meeting, and I was like, sorry, committee, I gotta go. So it was very chaotic, and truth be told, I've actually never been on a job market type search or given much thought to it, but I think the things that have probably gotten me here are engaging with people as people. I think part of that is because of my experience at U of M being very non-hierarchical, but so valuable when you have such a little time with people. If you have, say, an hour-long plane ride and you happen to be sitting next to someone on the airplane, and you don't have to talk to everybody on airplanes, but I've had some great interactions. I think another is how to ask questions. So how do you ask questions of people that show that you're interested in them as a person, not just their job? It's a kind of a big turnoff when someone asks you a lot of questions and it's clear that they just want your job. Mm-hmm. You're like, it's kind of weird. That is related to the networking. I think also I really tried to make my own luck in that if I liked something, I went for it. So I taught as a GSI with the program in intergroup relations. I really loved it. I could only teach one semester with them. And I remember I contacted the director and I said, I really love it. I wish I could teach, but I can't anymore. Anything you need done, I will change the trash cans over the summertime. I also needed summer funding. But, and they said, I'm so sorry, we don't have anything for you right now. But a few months later, a project came up and they needed someone, and because I was so desperate, I stood out in their minds that they contacted me, and then I just kept doing more projects. I got lots of great experience that way. It was really lovely, and that kind of led me to here now. What I do now is really fun. I was hired on as a pilot director. I work in undergraduate education, which is a division of the College of LSA. It's focused just on undergraduate students. Honors program is part of undergrad ed as well. What I do, I was hired. Let me start back. There was actually a first pilot director who was not me. I worked for him as a graduate student assistant on one of these special projects. And he had a life change and decided this was not the place for him. And he left very suddenly. And everyone said, oh, we're kind of screwed right now. It's August, the school year's about to begin. What are we going to do? So it was a very short, very rapid job search. Because I worked as a grad student, I was the only one here who was still here who actually knew what had been going on. That's how it happened. But what I was given was really lovely, and I was told, create a living learning community that's focused around global issues, that brings together international and U.S. students, that's focused on social justice, and just, make the world a better place. I was like, okay. One of the charges with that also was create a new kind of classroom. Part of this was also acknowledging that about 60% of our undergraduates do not study abroad, which is traditionally considered the most effective form of intercultural engagement. So what do we do about that? Let's come up with other ways to get them intercultural engagement. One was to create the living learning community where, I don't know how Honors does it, but we do not let our students pick their roommates, which we hear from a lot of parents about that actually, but it's good because they get to mix up. And then another was to create this class where we would video conference with other countries. And so actually Liliana's sister has helped me out on a number of occasions with our Czech Republic connection. And so that meant that I, one, had to be confident and just reach out to people and really utilize some personal networking. And two, just be okay with not knowing what was going on. Multitasking. But what came out of it is I've been able to I did a lot of travel, so I went to Czech Republic, I went to Vancouver, Seoul, Korea, Cape Town, South Africa, been Taiwan, a lot of places that I wouldn't have gone otherwise, met really wonderful colleagues. And also, what that allowed me to do is see how organizations are structured that are not University of Michigan. So when you talk about exposure to organizational structures, that can be important too. And I've just had a lot of fun with it. I think at the core of it, I fiercely care about my students. We are, I work in undergraduate education. Our students are our mission. I have and it's really to provide an experience that helps students at many different levels. So as much as we try to have students come out with the same experience, it doesn't necessarily happen. But for some students, we just provide a place where it's really nice to live. For others, you get that gem it's that opportunity to really let that student blossom, that maybe 1 in 100, maybe 1 in a couple hundred, but you're like, wow, they are amazing, and they're already changing the world, and it's just such a rewarding experience to be part of that. So,
Well, thanks to all of our panelists. As Jennifer pointed out, we have all had very different paths into an alternative academic career. And they're all very different types of careers. So to me, that just kind of gives a sense of the broad scope of the types of opportunities that are out there. So I just wanted to now spend the rest of the time inviting questions from the audience. Karishma Colette, who she's actually a postdoc at CRLT with a PhD in biology. So she'll be helping sort of pass the mic around for questions, but I just want to throw it out to the audience to see what questions people might have for our panelists. I see a hand up here in the front.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could speak a little more specifically about comparing working with students in an advising context versus working with them in a classroom setting.
You want to start, or you want to start?
Well, I can say I do a little bit of both. In a classroom setting, well, sure. I should say that because I work in a living learning community, if I have students in my classroom, most of them also live in the community. And most of them, even if they don't want the advising, I will give it to them. And it's it's a different kind of relationship. So if you see me with my students, then sometimes I'll make fun of them, or I'll pick on them a little, or I'll just say, you need to do this. It's much more of a direct kind of role. And that's one of the nice things about a living learning community, is that you don't have your students just in that classroom and then they leave.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes that's a drawback, but.
So I really like having a diachronic relationship with students, and I had this with some of my students in classics, but mostly I had a synchronic slice of their experience. They came into my classroom, I knew them in that context, I graded them, and then unless I wrote a letter of recommendation for them later, or in a couple of cases where they took multiple classes for me, I didn't have that diachronic relationship with them. I sought that, and this is one of those things that I look backwards. I did the ONSP mentorship program, and every year would have a cohort of 6 or 7 students, and out of that, 1 or 2 would develop into a mentoring relationship that we would carry on. And so from that, I also started learning more about student life outside of my classics courses. So again, I mean, sort of embarrassing when I first came, and again, I was so focused on getting my stuff done, and so student distribution or even administrative stuff of how the college worked, I didn't really have that much of an idea. And now I've got a really great grasp, I think, on undergrad ed as a whole. I love when the new course guide comes out. Not only looking in philosophy and classics, but I've got favorite classes. I've actually drawn up a 2-page sheet for pre-med students. I think about 80% of the honors program is pre-med. And so we have fabulous courses in medical history, ethics, anthropology of medicine, sociology, public health. There was a great course in women's studies on autobiography and what is it? Autobiography, medicine, the female body, or something like that. Medical humanities. So I spent an afternoon pulling out all of these classes that I had discovered in conversations with students, and the culmination of that, what I was doing before I came into honors, and I do this still some in the honors program, was the individual concentration program, where students can design their own major. And so there I really was working with them on proposing an interdisciplinary topic and pulling courses from a bunch of different areas. So I love having that whole piece. One of my jobs now is with honors housing, so I'm learning more of the student affairs side of life, and starting to know a little bit more about the residential side. And so again, I'm broadening and getting more of that holistic view of what undergraduate education is. And I've really found that to be intellectually interesting as well as professional development or something like that.
Yeah, any other questions, or do you have anything to add,
Not
Liliana?
really. I can just say that my role in advising concerns mostly career advice. What's next after we graduate? What do we do with our degrees in art history or archaeology, classics in some cases, and how their hands-on experience with art can really benefit them in future careers or grad school applications?
I can add that even though I have not been on a proper job search path myself, I have been a part of a number of hiring committees, and it always makes me wonder, wow, how did I ever get hired? That's how I felt as a grad student. I was on a number of admissions committees. I was like, oh my gosh. And a question I've heard asked a number of times, especially in positions that might have anything to do with student affairs, even if it's an academic affairs position, is what is the difference between advising and mentoring? I still don't know, but I've heard it asked a lot in interviews. So just FYI. And also for something, I teach intercultural competency, and I didn't realize how important that is to have. Some people already have it as life experience, others don't. But in a professional capacity, because a lot of times when we're advising students, we might have a student come in who's really upset because they got an A- on their econ exam. And you're like, really, an A- on the Econ 401 exam? Like, that's really great. And just feeling so much stress and then realizing, wait, this student is an international student from China. They're the only child. So much of there's so much pressure from their family that they're putting on themselves because they know of what their family is sacrificing. And then as our administrative assistant, I thought was so brilliant in just really taking in the context, was looking at the student and saying, I'm going to give you a glass of water, then you're going to go eat a sandwich, and then you're going to take a nap. And then everything was better. So it's kind of this ability to take in the whole picture of life experience with the academics and so forth.
And that's really gratifying in a way. I don't want to go too long on this one question, but I will say, in research and teaching, everything is about long-term benefits, right? I mean, there's a lot of delayed gratification. And one of the things I found that I like is a mix of long-term projects and immediate gratification. So there's a lot of immediate gratification that comes out of that kind of conversation. And while I do like working with sort of really high-achieving students and that sort of, there's also those great moments where you get to intervene for the better in the life of somebody that's struggling. And so there's an immediate applicability that I know that what I'm doing right now is the most important thing that I should be doing. When that student's in my office, all of those other things. And that's exhausting to do all the time. I want the long-term projects as well, but that was one thing that I discovered moving from. I sometimes had those in conversations with students, intellectual conversations, but that's something else I discovered.
Yeah.
So I wonder if a lot of us are probably in a similar position where professionalization for our field is done in a very specific way. So it's very ingrained that the job market happens kind of once a year, and I think that's becoming more decentered. But I just wondered, and it sounds like you guys have different paths, but I wondered if you had any advice for someone who is looking for one of these types of positions specifically, places to go to find good sort of databases, ways to build experience or a CV to reflect that. I like what Dr. Tyson was saying about, you're kind of listing things because that's the way you've been taught to, but when you really think about a skill set and trying to speak specifically to that. So I just wondered about kind of pragmatic advice for, seeking something out from a person who's really ingrained about how you're supposed to go about, finding a job.
And I'm curious if folks are interested in, quote, like non-traditional academic careers, what kind of things you're looking for?
Yeah, I think advising faculty development is kind of
Yeah. Other folks? Publishing? Ooh.
Do you want to stay here, or are you looking nationally?
It's just hard to know kind of where to start, I guess. And I'm
Yeah.
you go to kind of different places, so I wonder.
Have you looked in the Chronicle of Higher Education? Yeah, that's one place.
So I used to look a lot at the jobs posting, on umich.edu, and then you can go in, and then it's organized. So academic and student services is the category under which you'd find advising and other types of positions like what I do. Honestly, I would go to Paula Wishart. She used to be one of my go-to people to send students to when she was at the Career Center, and I think she's a fantastic person to brainstorm and have this conversation with. So I would go to her, and what she'll tell you, what I've heard her tell students is, when you apply for a position that's being offered, you're then at the most competitive point, right? This is the point that it's publicly announced and anybody can go. And so what she'll probably think about having you do is, what sorts of things are you interested in? Who could you go talk to? For advising, you should go talk to Tim Dodd in the Noonan Academic Center. You can tell him that I sent you. I'd be happy to talk with you. I don't know who at CRLT Laura might mention, but if you wanted to talk to people and go and just do informational interviews and find out about that. But then that also lends to and at CRLT I just found out what are ways that I could get involved. I used to do stuff with CRLT players and other things like that. So,
I would say, just to emphasize something that Henry's done, and actually Molly did this with me, who just asked a question, but is to feel free to email people on campus and say, hey, what do assistant directors at CRLT do? Can I have 20 minutes of your time? And people like to tell their story. People like to share about their career path. And so I think taking advantage of the fact that you're at a huge research university where there are very diverse types of units and people in really different types of roles. And in terms of branching out to other campuses, Rackham, through the Mellon Foundation, has a program called the Intercampus Mentorship Program, where you can say, I'd actually really like to have that kind of conversation with Liliana Milkova at the the Allen Museum, and you can go to, there's several partner institutions in Michigan that Rackham will give you the funding to go take someone out to lunch to have that kind of an informational interview. So that's useful to know that you can kind of develop those types of short mentorship conversations at other types of institutions that might have positions or types of units that are interesting to you. I know for me, one of the most valuable things that I did, which I shared a little bit about earlier, but was to really just sit down with people and hear from them, and not in the way I kind of liked how Jennifer made the distinction between saying, like, I want a job here or something like that. I really just was curious about them as people, and what do you do at CRLT, and what do you think the benefits and the drawbacks are, and just having a conversation with people here, I think, can be really productive to help you make sense out of what you might find in the job listings on, Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle. I think both of those I've kind of mentioned on the agenda handout here, but the Versatile PhD website, if you have a unique name, you have the ability to go onto this Versatile PhD site, and there's actually, you can see people's CVs, their cover letters, and contact them to ask them questions about their alternative academic career paths. So that's another resource here at University of Michigan. That's kind of a national database of people who've taken diverse career paths with their PhDs.
If I could just highlight something Laura said, was feel free to ask somebody if they can talk to you for 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. Cut off time. I'll just say that if a colleague or a friend says, can you talk to this student? I will, as a favor to that person I already know. If a student does a cold call, contact me, especially if they do not have a set time. I won't respond to them anymore. The reason for that is because I had a number of graduate students who did seek me out, and I felt, I'll be dramatic, I felt like I was held hostage for 90 minutes. I'm like, really? When you think about how valuable time is, how fast-paced our work was, how at the time I was already working 60 to 70 hours a week, like, really, I have to go. No. And it really felt like they were asking me just, how can I get your job? And I'm like, this isn't enjoyable for me. And it's actually taking away from my job duties. So just as a caution, it really helps a lot. Say, 20 minutes, or over lunch, over coffee, something that the person would want to do anyways, or have someone introduce you.
I'm not totally sure how to formulate this question, but I was struck by something you said about how in an academic environment you can really sort of ask these open-ended questions for the sake of asking questions,
Sometimes.
Right, yes, sometimes. I want to connect that to the role of research. I mean, so many of us in this room are getting trained in how to do research, and some of you specifically said that, research is not a big part of what you're doing, or it's petered out or whatever, but I was hoping that you could speak to either how research is a part of your job currently, or how you use the research skills that you gained in graduate school in your jobs.
Well, I research all the time because faculty from multiple disciplines come to me and say, I'm teaching a class, let's say a biology class, it's an animal physiology class. However, we're looking at what happens in the body when the body is experiencing strong emotions, all those physiological processes of the human body. So I want to incorporate art in this session. And so I am constantly researching the topic, researching representations of strong emotions in the East versus the West, because that was one of the assignments that the professor was interested in giving to the students. So every day I'm dealing with a different topic from a different time period, different culture. Maybe only 10% of the time I'm staying in the modern and contemporary period, which is what I was trained to do. But because I studied the entire history of art, at some point in my career, I'm constantly going back, pulling various textbooks and publications and revisiting those topics. So really, research is a huge part of my job. And also narrowing things down specifically for the particular subject that is of interest to the professor on the other side, and boiling things down to a couple of points that are accessible, intelligible, and really speak to that main question that is the professor's concern.
Yeah, and I know at CRLT, so CRLT stands for the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. We actually do quite a bit of research over there, assessment of curriculum or assessment of how a course is going, and that would be survey research, which is my training, or focus groups, or some combination of both. I also have done a lot of publishing since I've been at CRLT. In only the 2 years that I've been there, I've co-authored, I think, 3 articles. And what I want to emphasize is that what I love about my job is that I can do as much or as little research that's kind of above and beyond the classroom research or the research I do for my clients, or as much as I want, and my promotion isn't based on me performing that research in a specific period of time the way you would be if you were on a tenure clock. So something that was very attractive to me about the field was that early in my career stage, I could, when I was having children, I just had my second child about 7 months ago, I could take a break and pull back from research and not feel like that was going to hurt me in terms of my promotion. And yet I still have found, because of the collaborative nature of our work and the fact that co-authorship is seen as justifying things, since there isn't that sort of tenure piece, I found that I've been a lot more productive on outside research than I expected to be.
I actually found my current position does not really have space for that research focus in the way that I was trained, and I actually found that I miss it. I do. I have not published in the past few years. I never did anything with my dissertation, which I feel terribly guilty about. It's, we've been meaning to get to it for the past 3 years because, to be told, actually, you have findings that are new and are a contribution to the field, but then never actually getting to that publication point is a bit, it makes me feel guilty and bad in sorts of ways. But with my position, there's a very careful balance. So if I want to do anything that's not directly related to my position, so sometimes I get asked to do outside consultation. So Cranbrook High School, upper school is nearby, but I've been, I used to fly out to Florida a lot to work with Broward College and other places. The current position that I have, and I don't think it's a college policy, but I think it's a policy through my immediate supervisor. I have to ask permission if I can consult or not, even though I take a vacation day for the day that I consult. So it's kind of like is it okay for you to take a vacation day given the current workload status situation? So what I do appreciate from one of the great CRLT programs when I was a graduate student was I think it's called Quick Starter or something like that, of recommendations of, integrate your research with what you're doing at the time. If you're teaching, do research on your teaching. I've seen great results with colleagues doing that. For myself, my focus is I've done assessment, and so program assessment is really exciting to me. Unfortunately, I think last year, probably for the last year and a half, I had been trying to collaborate, and it is different. So one of the big learning moments for me was what it's like to work on something like research assessment that I had experience with and been trained in, with people who had not had experience or had experience in different kinds of ways, and we just were not speaking the same language. So a lot of like, how do you adapt, and then also, how do you know when to pull out, or what is best, not necessarily so much for your career, but for your program or whatever your mission is for your job at the time.
Actually, what I like about my job, the research part of it, is that I'm constantly researching multiple topics, putting together very neat lectures about these different subjects. However, I don't have to do anything with the research afterwards. I can just move on and pick up another topic. And no need for any elaborate, long-term, massive, polished productions.
The first year in advising, my wife said, I don't remember when I've seen you read so many novels. I was sort of released. Were we talking about this before?
Yes,
I was
we were.
It was a constant negotiation when I would see lectures on campus. Should I be doing this? I always felt guilty if I was working on something. Ironically, I did my best publishing my first probably year or two, and it's just because that's when the pipeline stuff kind of came out the way that it did. I mean, I finished my book. I got an article, just a short note in classical philology. I started writing shorter, small pieces and on some textual stuff. And but in all honesty, I don't know. I don't feel pushed to go back to that. And it kind of depends on what you mean by research. I mean, I do have this attitude of whatever I'm doing, well, what's the literature on this say? I mean, who's doing a really good job of this kind of fellowship advising, and Duke, for example, has had like 20 Rhodes winners in the last 20 years. So what is Duke doing, right? I mean, we've got that caliber of students. So I've got sort of that attitude, and I have that a lot actually in conversations with students, because I talk to them a lot about developing potential topics for research theses or for grant proposals and various things like that. So sometimes I bring some of that. But I enjoyed that sort of dilettantism that Liliana talked about, that I can do that for a bit. And I haven't published anything on advising. I thought at first, when I first came, that I would do something like that, because I read some of the literature and I thought, oh, I could write something like this. But I don't know. Sort of at the end of the day, I enjoy my student interactions, and if it comes down to having those student conversations or going out to lunch with a student or doing other things, I haven't been willing to cut out of my time in order to carve out that writing space. Maybe at some point I'll come back to it, but I also have two small kids, so that impacts how I think about it too.
Yes. If you want to talk about work-life balance, I think this is the panel to ask.
You have kids?
I have a toddler, and actually, I was brought up in the academic environment, and and I was, that's just what I was used to, and I didn't realize, I had no concept of how maternity leave worked on the administrative side of things, because I had seen it a lot in faculty life, but not I got these charts with the federal regulation. I had to go back to human resources a couple of times, because I just could not wrap my head around it. And they were like, could you please explain this to me again slowly? It was just different. So I did get the 6 weeks maternity leave, but then I used up a lot of saved vacation time to extend it. I work with a lot of international partners and confirm that, yes, we have the shortest maternity leave by far. My Czech colleague said, oh, are you taking 1 or 3 years off?
Fully paid, too.
Yes.
At least the first year.
Yeah,
and 80% the second or something.
Yeah, or like, oh, how long is your partner taking paid time off for? What?
Yeah, no, I do think actually you bring up an important point that a lot of people may not realize, which is that there's been a lot of movement in the faculty community to create, paid semester leave for those who have family commitments, whatever those family commitments might be. And in an administrative position, there has not been that same level of space made for people who have family commitments. So just something to be aware of, that there is not a tenure clock, and I do feel that, so I only work 4 days a week, and I've created a part-time position where I'm officially working 28 hours, and most faculty on the U of M campus, according to survey research, work 60 hours. So I feel like, so I'm working many fewer hours than my typical assistant professor friends, but my maternity leave was a lot shorter than theirs. So that is something for people who are thinking about this to be aware of. And it may even be negotiable. I didn't negotiate that, but something to look at when you're looking at alternative academic careers is what is the policy for administrators at that university for family or medical leave.
I was actually stunned by something that you said. You called it the dual career office. And I can tell you that at Oberlin, for example, there is no spousal hires for administrative staff, period. They would do that for faculty members, but not for the administration. So administrative positions would not be able to negotiate any kind of spousal hire, as far as I'm aware, as far as I've experienced it firsthand.
So yeah, another good question to ask.
Absolutely. And perhaps this is something that's negotiable early on before you have accepted an offer. Perhaps not, but just keep in mind there's that too.
I saw a hand up front earlier, yeah.
I'm just wondering if now it's become more popular for PhDs to go into academic administration positions. Like, are you the only PhDs, in your departments, or are more and more is it becoming popular? And also, is there a lot of movement around from like university to university, college to college? Like, are there conferences and meetings where you get to talk with your peers and perhaps like even like job networking?
So I can speak for at most faculty development centers, most teaching centers, people have PhDs now. And I think that wasn't true 20 years ago, and the field is very new and it's rapidly expanding. But everyone at CRLT who's working in an assistant director or instructional consultant role has a PhD. And if you look at, there's a listserv called the Professional and Organizational Development Network, POD, P-O-D network. And if you sign up to receive their job announcements, typically they ask now for a PhD as a requirement of the job. And they do have a national conference each year. And there is a lot of movement. One of our assistant directors recently is moving to Carnegie Mellon. So there is movement in the field.
Where I work through undergraduate education, I don't know if it's necessarily popular. I think that's how it's been for a while. All of the directors are at, it's a requirement, pretty stated to be at the PhD level. Our dean's office administrators are tenure track faculty who've been full professors, so that's kind of a different kind of administrative track, where you do the tenure track faculty and then go into administration later for a period of time. The assistant directors for the learning communities, or most of our programs, will advertise a master's degree required, but PhD preferred. So if you can imagine the candidate pool, if there are competitive PhD candidates, they might look more appealing. Yeah.
And these are PhDs in the individual disciplines as opposed to PhD in education or some sort.
Yeah, something that's really important at least Michigan's teaching center is that people have disciplinary expertise. So we have chemists, biologists, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, because if you as an anthropologist want someone to visit your class, you probably want someone who can speak your language to talk with you about what might help your students to learn. So there's an intentional non-hiring of people with education degrees, if that makes sense.
Are you in education? Oh, no, okay.
Sorry to those in education.
English. Oh, we love English students.
I would just, I mean, of all the career paths to go down, I would hope that, academia itself would be one of the areas where I could, be proud of my PhD and it would be a little bit easier for me to make the argument that my skill set would be transferable.
I think be proud of your degree. Garrison Keillor is proud of your degree. Just embrace it. But I think also, especially in interviews, this really comes out, it strikes me as how important the anecdotes are and in relating to things. So it's actually like in the amount of time people look over your application, it's okay, that's your degree, check. But there's most of the time is spent on other things. And so I know when I was a graduate student, I sat on admissions committees, and that was very helpful. But also I was a representative on the Rackham Student Forum, so I'd go to the meetings where Dean Weiss was facilitating, and it was just kind of nice to go to that level and hear things going on at the university. In the psychology department, I was my area delegate, so I would go to the faculty meetings, which I loved because you see all the drama play out. So at the time, I just enjoyed that, and I was also involved in student organizations and starting new programs. And I didn't realize that at the time that actually that helped me in my job because it involves really having a knowledge of the university structure. And then also being aware of things at national levels. Like I was fortunate enough to be involved in helping with presentations to the provost's office, and then later I was asked to be on a committee for the National Task Force on Arts and Education for the College Board, and that was a really wonderful experience because I got to meet people directly from the National Endowment for the Arts, National Teachers of the Year, President of the College Board, and you talk to them as people, but you really get to see kind of in an informal setting, not because you could read their reports and so forth, but how they're really operating. And maybe an example is I was on an airplane. I ended up sitting next to Mayor David Bing of Detroit, who must be really stressed out right now. And I didn't know who he was. I was like, wow, people are so nice to this guy, and he's really tall. And I didn't know he was a professional basketball player before. So. But we ended up chatting, and and it just turned out that we knew close people in common, and we just had a really nice conversation. And I just asked him questions. I've done this with people, and what are some of the challenges? What was it like when you first started out as a business person? And he could say, what it was really like, or I'd ask, what was it like growing up, or what is it like working in Detroit in government now? Much slower than business. So. But I think also I'd like to bring up the concept of social identities. I'm a racial minority, whatever that means, it means something. So when I have interactions, when students come to me, I'm sensitive to such things. And I think that it matters. And when I tell my students, intercultural competency is important. It really is, and it's not just international U.S. So I learned quite a lot collaborating with colleagues from Howard University. Morehouse is having something down the hall. Very different campus cultures, climates. I've heard colleagues be very upset that they were treated disrespectfully, but not telling the person who they thought was being disrespectful at the time. There's just an awareness. The more exposure you can get, the better. I think, and just very important, and just treating people as people in all of this.
So we actually are out of time. I wanted to ask people there's a yellow kind of evaluation sheet here. I would really appreciate your comments on the session. And I just want to thank, again, all of our panelists for sharing their career paths and their insights. So thanks again.
Thank you, Laura.